This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you're tuned in to When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter the most. It is such a great pleasure to have Dr. Iain MacLeod on the show today. Iain is a co-founder, CEO, and chief science officer of Aldatu Biosciences, where he's responsible for leading the advancement of Aldatu's pathogen and drug-resistant diagnostic technology, in addition to guiding the company's global health strategy. Prior to founding Aldatu in 2014, Iain received his postdoctoral training at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Botswana Harvard AIDS Institute in Botswana, where he focused on HIV drug resistance. Iain also serves as a research fellow in the Department of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at the Harvard School of Public Health. He's author or co-author on more than 14 peer-reviewed papers, and he also holds several patents related to Aldatu's Panda diagnostic testing platform. Iain earned his Ph.D. in pathology, specializing in molecular virology, from the University of Cambridge, and an LLM in international law and a Bachelor of Science in virology from the University of Glasgow. Welcome to the show, Iain. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
So I'd like to start by having you kind of walk through a little bit about your background so listeners get a sense of how you got interested in pathology and virology and kind of what led you down into the kind of journey that you're in right now.
Well, it certainly wasn't very well planned. It wasn't really a straight line, to be honest. You know, when I was at the University of Glasgow doing my undergraduate degree, I had the opportunity in the third year of my four-year degree to specialize, and I think it was one of 21 different biology majors. And I always knew that I was interested in infectious diseases, but wasn't quite sure if it was going to be virology, bacteriology. I finally settled on virology. One of the reasons was that the UK government's Centre for Virus Research was based at the University of Glasgow. Mm-hmm. So there really was a huge faculty specializing in every single aspect of virology. That coupled with the fact there were only 5 people that were going to be in my class, it was a very intimate but intense educational experience, which I ended up loving. Uh-huh. And by virtue of, the reputation of virology at Glasgow, I was offered the PhD position at the University of Cambridge, working on virology, specializing in the entry of herpes simplex virus into human cells, mm-hmm. And how the virus might precondition the cell for its arrival during its binding to the cell surface. Mm-hmm. So after that, when I was completing my PhD, and my PhD was very much science for the sake of science, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I enjoyed virology, but I was interested in something that had more of a kind of clear path to human health, to medical interventions. And it was from there I came across Professor Max Essex at the Harvard School of Public Health. Max is a renowned figure in HIV/AIDS. He's been working in Botswana for almost 3 decades, and he was the person that came up with the theory that it was a retrovirus that could be causing what we now call HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. And he offered me a 1-year position working in HIV drug resistance. And I ended up working so closely with MDs because it was the School of Public Health. And from there, I could see the direct translation of the work I was doing in the lab to helping people with HIV specifically in Botswana, because that's where Max did the majority of his work. And it is through that I found, I kind of fallen in love with virology again, and wanted to pursue a career in it.
Interesting. Really interesting. Thanks for that background, Iain. And, in addition to your PhD in pathology, you also have an LLM in international law. So I'm curious as to how that came about.
So it fits into the story of really not really sure if I wanted to continue my education in virology, knowing that most of the work or all of the work in education I had was very molecular and cellular biology heavy. I'd never really been exposed to public health or global health. And my PhD supervisor, Tony Minson, who was professor of virology at Cambridge, allowed me to defer for a year. He had a second PhD student starting at the same time, so he wanted to stagger us. And I thought, okay, I get 12 months off and figure out what I want to do. And I'd actually spent the third year of my undergraduate degree at the University of Barcelona. I ended up living with people who were studying just about every subject you can imagine. And I'd always been interested in everything on a global scale. And in the UK, law is considered an undergraduate degree. So if you already have a bachelor's degree, you can do a law degree in 12 months. And the University of Glasgow has a specialty in international law. And I thought, I'll see if I can use another part of my brain that I really didn't use when I was studying virology.
Right.
I'll be honest, I loved it. I ended up working kind of in an intersection, looking at the legality of biological and chemical weapons. And part of me always thinks if I hadn't gone on to do virology, I'd be a lawyer of some sort.
Well, let me ask you just a little bit about that. It's really, really fascinating to hear that, how that all kind of materialized, and whether you think now in your current role, whether any of the activities or perspectives or approaches, things from your other side of your brain that you were exercising for those 12 months plus, whether those things inform what you do now in any ways.
Studying international law, I think, definitely helped a lot. Helped me when it came to working in global health. Having had no previous experience when I started working at Harvard, it got me preconditioned to think on a global scale. But then, at a more granular level, running a company has actually been incredibly useful. When we incorporated the company, we didn't use lawyers, saved ourselves a few $1,000s. We did the incorporation ourselves. And, it does come in handy when you're scanning over contracts. Lawyers aren't the cheapest people to have on retainer. So it does, the skills I learned studying law do come into play now and again, but not that often.
Great. Well, you mentioned the company, and I'd like you to tell listeners a bit more about what led you to co-found Aldatu Biosciences.
Well, you're going to start to see a pattern in my career path, and it's going off in stray directions that I never really intended to, but ended up loving. So while I was working on HIV drug resistance in Botswana, I was working closely with an MD, Christopher Rowley, who is an infectious disease physician at the Beth Israel in Boston. And he had a study to look at transmitted HIV drug resistance. So HIV drug resistance is like antibiotic resistance. If the antiretrovirals aren't taken at the right time, then, or the correct dosage, then resistance to the drugs can arise. But the resistance can actually be transmitted to newly infected individuals. So someone who is recently infected with HIV could already have resistance to antiretrovirals, and that really reduces the treatment options available to them. And in Botswana, or rather, generally speaking, the population that we look for transmitted drug resistance for HIV antiretrovirals is young women who are pregnant with their first child, is they're the most likely to become recently infected. So in this study, we were using standard Sanger sequencing to do drug resistance testing. It was considered the gold standard. just generic sequencing. And what we found was that women were coming into the antenatal clinic. We were getting a blood sample from them, and we were doing the resistance genotype. But those women were put onto antiretrovirals to prevent them transmitting HIV to their unborn child. And I think it's one of the triumphs of HIV global health is that the mother-to-child transmission rate is dropped to almost zero, because we know that early treatment interventions when a woman is pregnant can really cut the risk of transmission to their unborn child. But the issue was we were identifying women with transmitted resistance. They had resistance to the antiretrovirals they'd been put on to prevent their unborn child from becoming infected with HIV, yet we knew from our study their drugs were not going to work. So we were able to tell their physicians they were put on to alternative treatment regimens, and all of the women gave birth to healthy HIV uninfected infants. But it was only by virtue of being on our study that these women got the resistance test in the first place. And that was because even though Botswana has probably one of the best public health HIV treatment programs in the African continent, drug resistance testing was solely using Sanger sequencing, and it cost about $300 a year. Now, when treatment costs between $150 per person per year, there's never an economic incentive to do resistance testing. So Chris and I got thinking, there has to be a better way to do resistance testing. There has to be a way to ensure that everyone has access to the best treatment possible. And how do we go about doing that? And that was the kick, I suppose, or the start of developing the technology Panda, which then kind of snowballed into starting a biotech startup.
So cool. Really, really cool. In February, you wrote an article in StatNews in which you make a point that may startle people who are listening, essentially saying, we can't vaccinate our way out of this pandemic. Achieving this focus on achieving herd immunity through mass vaccination may even make it tougher for America, you wrote. And that may make it harder to defeat COVID-19 and ultimately. And I would really appreciate if you could elaborate for our listeners what you meant by that.
Sure. And with my article, the point I was really trying to get across was that, since the beginning of the pandemic, our government has focused a lot on short-term goals, rather than really considering what's the best way to deal with the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the pandemic, really getting to grips with understanding that it's going to become endemic. We're not going to get rid of it. And there's, I think for a long time now, there's been this almost blind faith in achieving herd immunity. If we get to this magical number of around 70% of people with protective antibodies, the pandemic is going to come to a grinding halt, and we can all go back to our normal lives. With no discussion about, the various factors that have to, fall into place for us to get to herd immunity. Is it even possible? But also, that's only one single public health intervention. We have to consider like a multi-pronged approach, particularly, as I said, understanding that this is going to become endemic. So I think some people certainly interpreted my article as maybe taking an anti-vaxxer approach, which, is really not the case. Their vaccines are fundamental to our collective response.
Right.
And I just wanted our governments to acknowledge that they need to think beyond vaccination programs, to acknowledge that there are so many unknowns about the vaccines. Do they produce sterilizing immunity? We know they're fantastic for reducing incidence of severe COVID and hospitalizations, but are people actually just walking around with asymptomatic infection instead? How long is the durability of the immune response going to last? Are we going to need boosters? But just selling this one single story to the public really kind of irked me, because it's if we don't have an open dialogue about what's coming next and how to prepare for it adequately, then I think a lot of people are going to, become very upset, very disappointed, very more frustrated than they are now.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent point. I read, in reading your article, in no way did I think it was anywhere near the realm of anti-vaxxers. I mean, it really was pointing out the cold, hard math associated with herd immunity, and given the percentages of people, the high percentage of people would have to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. And then looking at the percentages that we think, either are going to decline vaccination or are too young, because there was no representation of people under 16 or different vaccines, in the clinical trials. Different vaccines differ with that respect. So I found it very much along the lines of what you intended, which is like, yes, but no silver bullet, and here are the other things that we need to be focused on at this point. I think it was really smart from a expectations management type of standpoint as well. In that piece, I was also interested in a point you made about the need to strengthen the U.S. public health infrastructure. And I think this crisis has clearly laid bare what many in the field have known for a long time, which is the public health infrastructure is in terrible shape. Of course, as is our physical infrastructure, but that's another podcast episode on another show, I suppose. But just thinking about the public health infrastructure and looking into the future, are there improvements, priorities that you think should really be near the top of the public health policy agenda?
Yeah, so when I was writing that article, one thing I was thinking about when I was mentioning the need to reinforce the public health infrastructure was, dealing with variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that have already started to emerge. I think as of yesterday, we had the first case of the Brazilian variant in Massachusetts, and really having the technology and the expertise in place to understand better how these variants are impacting our public health response to the pandemic, but also, keeping an eye on what other variants may arise. The UK variant was only really discovered because in the UK, they genotype about 10% of all positive cases. I think it was below 3%, or maybe it's maybe below 0.3% in the US at the end of last year. But, things are looking up. The Biden administration, with the recent package that has been passed through Congress in terms of COVID relief, the CDC is looking to invest almost $250 million in expanding its sequencing capabilities to better understand what variants are present in the US. And, we're starting to see what we call the California variant and the New York variant. And it's hard to believe that, there aren't other very more prevalent variants out there. This is a big country. We've had a lot of SARS-CoV-2 infections. I find it hard to believe that we might be one of the only large countries to have not had its own variants start to circulate. And we know that these variants not only impact the sensitivity of COVID diagnostics, but some of the variants do reduce the efficacy of the vaccines. And now that we're investing more money in expanding a public health surveillance through the CDC, I think we'll be in a much better position to deal with what's ahead in terms of SARS-CoV-2 becoming endemic.
Dr. Iain MacLeod, thank you so much for being here on the show today. Your approach, your perspectives, and also the way you communicate them in such a clear, accessible way for non-virologists and non-scientists is really remarkable. So thanks for that, and also for the work that you do every day as CEO and Chief Science Officer of Aldatu Biosciences. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.